Good morning, everyone joining us from the United States, North America, Europe, and other parts of the world. Today, we are here joined by four dignified and intellectuals to discuss the Kurdish question in Iran in the light of the recent wave of protest movements across the country and beyond, and Iran's cross-border attacks on Kurdish groups, especially in Iraqi Kurdistan region. I am joined today with David Phillips, the director of the program on peace building and rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. He was a former advisor to the US Department of State and the United Nations Secretariat. Tara Azizi is with us. She is an international lawyer specializing in human rights. She worked with UN agencies in the past on human rights and worked with the Swedish Migration Agency, which I believe brings a lot of expertise regarding refugees escaping Iranian oppression. We are also joined by Arish Saleh, the representative of the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan to the United States. The KDPI is a Kurdish dissident party with militant activity inside Iran, especially in the Kurdish inhabited parts of Western Iran, which we are keen to hear about his political insights into the situation. We are also together with Salah Bayazidi, the representative of the Komala party to the United States. Komala is another Kurdish dissident party with political and limited scale militant activity inside Iran. Both of these political parties are exiled in Iraqi Kurdistan region, where the recent wave of airstrikes by Iran were conducted. Before we start, we'd like to pay our respects to the fallen civilians and Iranian activists over the past 14 days by keeping silent for 30 seconds. Thank you very much for joining me in silence. Let me give a very brief overview of what's happening in Iran for our viewers who may not be familiar with all the details. As of today, 76 people have been reported killed by the Norway-based Iran Human Rights Organization. It is imperative to mention that the official number is 41. It's still a significant number of that toll in accordance with the Iranian government sources. The protest movement in Iran started 14 days ago on 16 September after a Kurdish woman died in custody of the Iranian morality police, Zhina Mahsa Amini. She has been the center of the protest movement ever since it started. And interestingly so, the protest turned into a unifying factor for entire Iran and not only the Kurds, which is an interesting point that we will be discussing today. The majority of these protests have been in Iranian Kurdistan, namely the Kurdish inhabited regions, where, according to Kurdish sources, which I would be very happy to hear from Arish and Salah, that the number of the people who have been killed, wounded, or detained has reportedly been much larger than the rest of Iran. The protest movement of 2022 differs from previous protest movements in Iran in several aspects. The first is this is one of the largest that Iran has seen, perhaps the largest since 2009. But the biggest difference is that the protest movement of today has no unified or centralized leadership, or doesn't have any leader symbols. Unlike 2009, or previous protest movements in Iran ever since the revolution took place in 1979. That said, another distinct feature of the protest movement this year is the diversified issues that the protest movement is touching upon. Women and the Iranian regime's control over women's body and appearance is one of the central themes of these protests, but we have recently been hearing from Iranian groups that it's beyond, and not only about how women are treated by the Iranian regime. That said, Kurdish groups, especially the Kurdish exiled groups, have been participating in global action, calling for justice for Kurdish women in Iran. I'd like to mention here, for me, the most interesting point is that a traditionally Kurdish motto, slogan, women, life, and freedom, has been translated into Farsi and now being used by protesting masses across the country and beyond, which I believe an important point that has to be discussed to understand how the relations between the Kurdish community and the non-Kurdish community of Iran is changing in the light of these protests. And finally, widespread cross-border bombardment of Kurdish positions in Iraqi Kurdistan region has happened yesterday, marking an interesting and unprecedented milestone in Iran's cross-border operations against the Kurdish groups in Iraqi Kurdistan, because by the number of attacks happened over the past few days, it exceeds far beyond the previous Iranian cross-border operations in Iraqi Kurdistan. Without further ado, I'd like to start with David Phillips. And I want to ask the question that everybody wants to know. Why is it very hard to topple the Iranian regime? Can a protest movement, whether widespread or not, will ever be able to bring about a regime change in Iran?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join today's panel. I'm always pleased to associate with the Washington Kurdish Institute, which is the leading voice in DC on behalf of Kurdish issues. This panel comes at a particularly important time in the wake of violent protests across Iran that were catalyzed by the murder of Mahsa Amini by Iran's morality police on September 16, 2022. She was arrested for failing to cover her hair modestly in accordance with the hijab law, a relic of the Islamic Revolution that was adopted in 1981 and is still used by conservative clerics to justify their militant male theocracy. Though Mahsa was Kurdish, protests involve Iranians of various ethnic backgrounds who are chafing under Iran's authoritarian rule. Mostly, the Iranian people are fed up with the country's mismanaged economy, rampant corruption, its ineffective response to the COVID crisis, repression, and social restrictions. Chants of no to hijab, no to repression, only equal rights are increasing across the country. Women are opposing gender apartheid, demanding an end to the hijab law, and calling for abolition of the morality police. Women are on the front line demanding reform of the divorce law that shows preferences to men, laws that grant men exclusive custody of children, rules that allow polygamy for men. They are opposing laws that lower the marriage age for girls and require women to get permission from their husbands or fathers to travel. Women have been playing a leading role in political and social revolutions elsewhere. Let me cite a few examples here. First in Burma when Aung San Suu Kyi led protests against the State Law and Order Restoration Council. She won the Nobel Prize in 1991, but she ended up jailed by the Slork successor and is today imprisoned. In Liberia, Lema Groby and Ellen Sirleaf Johnson led the revolution against the participants in a civil war, and they were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in 2011. In Brazil, Dilma Rousseff mobilized opposition to the military dictatorship. She became president in 2011 until her impeachment by political opponents 5 years later in 2016. And also in the United States, we see women taking a leading role. The Women's March in DC in 2017, I remember attending with my teenage daughters as they shouted, "Love, not hate, makes America great." More recently, women protesters against the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade have shifted the political dynamics here in the US. Iranians, men included, are increasingly joining the movement and demanding political reform. They are protesting hypocrisy of the regime and autocratic rule of President Ibrahim Raisi, an ultra-conservative who tightened strict social and religious rules when he was chosen more than 1 year ago. His draconian rules have exacerbated social tensions. Women who are not covered properly are barred from the subway and from receiving social services. Iran's Ministry of Guidance instructed movie theaters to stop showing women in their advertisements. Women are arbitrarily arrested and sent for re-education. Instead of recognizing that unrest that is spreading across the country as the result of its domestic policies, the IRGC launched cross-border missile and drone attacks yesterday on Iraqi Kurdistan, killing scores of people and injuring many. Attacks targeted the headquarters of the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Party of Kurdistan of Iran, the Democratic Party of Kurdistan of Iran, PDKI, the Party for a Free Life for Kurdistan, and Komala in the provinces of Suleimani and Erbil. Tehran calls these organizations terrorist groups. Yesterday's escalation dramatizes the high stakes that Iran is facing these days. Raisi and the IRGC are trying to solve a problem by creating a bigger one. Iranians of all ethnicities, men and women alike, find violence to be intolerable. They want genuine political transition in Iran towards a federal parliamentary democracy. If the regime stands in the way, then the regime should be removed. The Cooperation Center adopted a joint statement this summer that was endorsed by the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and the Komala Party of Iranian Kurdistan. The statement embraced federalism as the most effective system for power sharing and enshrining the rule of law. Signatories reject Iran's centralization and concentration of power. They believe that federalism is the most efficient system of government to safeguard equality and non-discrimination, to protect and promote the unique identity of groups. The joint statement called for the establishment of self-governing institutions, a local executive, assembly, and judiciary, as well as police and security structures upholding the administration of justice and reflecting the communities that they serve. It calls for cultural rights in the form of education, language, media, cultural festivals, and cultural symbols. It also addresses economic development through local control of natural resources, property, and land management, as well as hiring preferences. With protests sweeping across the country, we must acknowledge that Iran is on the cusp of dramatic change. This is instigated by Iranians, not external forces. President Joe Biden wants to help the protesters communicate and organize. U.S. officials have been focused on renewing the JCPOA. They believe it is important, but they increasingly understand that Iran will only stop being a threat when there is regime change or the regime dramatically changes its behavior through decentralization, other sweeping democratic reforms, and the creation of accountable government. I'm pleased to give this overview of recent developments, to address the recent cross-border attacks, and to share with you the result of discussions that Columbia University and the Washington Kurdish Institute held with Iranian Kurdish partners, looking at governance strategies in the future that would decentralize power through federal arrangements. I'll stop here and look forward to getting questions later in the discussion.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Let me move to Tara. Tara, I have some particular questions to you that I took notes before coming here, because I believe you bring the perspectives of a woman, an Iranian, a Kurdish, and a human rights defender. Could you give us a very small overview of the past 14 days and what is happening, and how are these observed from your perspectives, this diverse perspectives you have?
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the Washington Kurdish Institute for arranging this well-needed and important webinar that we're having today, and thank you for inviting me. What we've seen the past days is being ongoing for so many days in Iran, started in the Kurdish areas, where men and women, Kurdish men and women, were chanting women, life, and freedom. And their chanting made it all the way from Kurdistan to Tehran, where demonstrations and people who participated from different minorities in Iran were chanting in Kurdish and Farsi, women, life, freedom. So this really created a women's rights movement that united the people of Iran, that united them in their fight against injustice, in their fight for their basic human rights, in their fight for accountability. The death of Zhina Amini, who was a Kurdish young woman, really created a rage amongst the Iranian people, not only the Kurdish people, we see that in all of Iran. And I think that the Iranian people, they've suffered from oppression for so many years, and they've had enough of systematic discrimination. They've had enough of something that we've been talking more about recently, intersectional discrimination. They've had enough of what also Dr. Philip mentioned, gender apartheid in Iran. So all of these factors, but also we have to mention the bad economy in the country, the high rate of unemployment in the country, well-educated women and men being unemployed, especially lack of job opportunities in remote areas outside of Tehran, and lack of equal political participation for all of Iran's people. So I think all of these factors, alongside Zhina Amini's death, created a rage and a movement that we see is hard for the Iranian regime to stop. I think that the uprising and the struggle in the Kurdish areas, it also goes back to the establishment of the Iranian regime. Many people in Iran, they've never voted for this constitution. They've never voted for these laws that is constantly discriminating women. Women's rights are severely restricted in Iran. This is not something new, and we've seen demonstrations in the past in Iran. But what's interesting with these events and these demonstrations is that the international attention of it, and the attention that human rights organizations and human rights lawyers are giving to it, and the reports that we are receiving from Iran, despite the restriction of internet access in Iran, we have received a lot of information about severe human rights violations and the regime cracking down on certain areas, such as the Kurdish areas, but also other minorities in Iran. We have to remember that I think is more than half of the population in Iran belongs to an ethnic or religious minority. So this struggle, this fight against injustice is unifying the country. And this is, of course, a threat towards the Iranian regime. They're cracking down with severe human rights violations. I get a lot of reports from organizations, different well-established organizations, although I cannot independently verify these numbers. But we've seen the past days that they're cracking down on some parts of the country, such as the Kurdish areas, using severe violence against protesters. And women are, unfortunately, always, when it comes to conflict areas, I've had experience of different areas and countries working with human rights, women are targeted. So these intersectional perspectives that I would say in the past demonstrations, when we've been observing human rights violations in Iran, have not been applied that much. But now that's a positive effect. People are talking about increasing the intersectional perspective when reporting about human rights violations in Iran today. The international community are giving more attention to what's going on in Iran. UN agencies, also the UN, but we see a unification from the international attention. That is very good through social media, journalists, human rights activists. So I think that human rights reporting and monitoring is one thing, and that needs to be continued the upcoming days. And we need to follow the situation in Iran. But also, when we have this attention and these reports, this also makes it easier for us to make sure that perpetrators can be held accountable in the future.
I have this question to you that I really want to hear from the Kurdish human rights defender perspective, which is, so Kurdistan, or the Kurdish inhabited areas, the Kurdish question, whatever you want to call it, also represent a deep issue, a source of conflict for Iran that goes past and beyond the Islamic Revolution. And today in Iran, a Kurdish slogan is being translated into Farsi, and you also mentioned that the masses are chanting Kurdish slogans. This may not bring about any change in the Iranian regime, or the regime may survive this crisis as well. But do you think such incorporation of Kurdish political characteristics by the Persian Iranian community can also ease the tensions between Iranian Kurds and the rest of the country when it comes to the so-called Kurdish issue?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. As I mentioned, this uprising, this movement, this women's rights movement and human rights movement in Iran have created a unification amongst Iran's people. And I think that the Iranian regime are turning to desperate methods in their way of increasing their violence against its people, all of its people, not only the Kurdish people, but again, they see the Kurds as the reason to this demonstration because it started in the Kurdish areas. I think this is positive. The Iranian people are showing solidarity. They are united. They are united against the Iranian regime and their way of severely restricting their rights, systematically restricting the rights of the Iranian people. So I think this is a positive outcome, I would say, that this movement is so widespread. We see it in all of Iran. All over Iran are protesting, and we see them using Kurdish and Farsi slogans, but also in other minorities, such as Baluch Lors, are gathering within this movement. And this is also why Iran so desperately is cracking down and increasing its violence against its people, because they know that unification amongst the Iranian people is something that is threatened their institution, their constitution, their laws that they want to put upon the Iranian people. So I think this is a positive outcome. And I hope to see more of that in the future, because they're all oppressed. Their human rights are severely restricted in Iran. We have to apply intersectional perspective that also will increase the understanding amongst the different people in Iran. So this is positive, but this is also threatening the Iran. That's why we see the desperate move of targeting not only Iranian citizens, Iranian people in Iran, but also targeting Iranian Kurdish refugees, women and children, civilians, innocent in Iraq, in the Kurdish part of Iraq. We see the moves are desperate because the people of Iran are unified, and the international attention is good towards this. I think that the international supporters and attention knows that the people of Iran are united, and their struggle for human rights is a struggle for all of Iran.
Thank you, Sarah. I initially wanted to continue with Salah, but given that you mentioned the cross-border attacks in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I believe most of them targeted the KDPI fortifications in Iraqi Kurdistan, I'd like to ask the question to Arish. Arish, David Philip and Tara mentioned several important points, which I believe some of them should be answered by you as well. One is, David said Iran is on the verge of a dramatic change, or might be on the verge of a dramatic change. And Tara mentioned two significant points, in my opinion. One of them was the protest movement united the Iranian people, which might be the first time in history. And the unification came about with the incorporation of Kurdish political characteristics, slogans, or the discourse, whatever you want to call it. Is KDPI, its subsidiaries, its partners and friends involved in these protests, or are the Kurdish groups, the Kurdish dissidents, being involved in this protest movement? And why do you think the Kurdish political discourse is being adopted by the rest of Iran in the light of these protest movements?
Well, thank you so much, Jang, and many thanks for WKI for this timely webinar. So your question has two different parts. Let's start with the first part, whether we as Kurdish political parties play any role in this recent uprisings. Well, actually, Kurdish political parties have a strong base, and they have been active for a long time, and people in there is a good relationship between people in Iranian Kurdistan, civil society in Iranian Kurdistan, and the Kurdish political parties. Whenever we have asked people to go on a strike, they do so, and this shows some sort of strong base in Iranian Kurdistan. But as it was mentioned previously, the case of Zhina Amini is the intersection of two different major issues in Iran. One, ethnic discrimination and ethnic issues in Iran, and from other side, it's like the women issues and the control of state over women's bodies. These two different issues have always been able to mobilize people in large scales. This time, putting these two together actually made it even more strong, even stronger in terms of mobilization, people being able to get together and control the streets in various cities. The Iranian government has always been trying to blame its issues and its problems and what happens in Iran and political parties and foreign states, on United States and various parties that are actually not involved in this. But it is imperative that we understand that the issue that is going on inside Iran is a collection of lots of grievances in the past few years, lots of cleavages in the past few years, and demands that had not been responded properly. That is correct that Kurdish political parties have strong base and they have good relationship with the people inside Iran, but it doesn't say anything about something being orchestrated by parties.
Can we understand that you support the movement?
definitely, the Kurdish political parties have supported the movement. The Kurdish political parties have played role in, mobilizing people, organizing people inside Iranian Kurdistan. But this issue, this uprisings are not something that, Kurdish political parties wanted to, or somehow, orchestrated in the whole Iran. It is true that Kurdish political parties basically asked for strike in Iranian Kurdistan. People, responded to that, and Kurdish Iranian society basically responded to the request from the Kurdish political parties, and took to the streets and basically started the uprising. But from there, and going to the other sides of Iran, other cities in Iran, more than 80 cities in Iran were involved in those protests.
So going back to Tara's points of unification of the people of Iran and unification of international attention, the diversification of the issue. It is not the first time that Kurdish masses are involved in a popular movement in Iran. In 1905, the Constitutional Revolution protests, 1977 to 1979, the protests leading to the Islamic Revolution had this Kurdish footprint at large. And each time the Kurds had high hopes that the ethnic issues might be set aside for the greater good of the Iranian people. Are you concerned, as the Kurdish parties, that this case might repeat, that the Kurdish masses may get involved in protests against, or popular movements against the Iranian regime, but in the end still not achieve their ethnic or ethno-nationalist ambitions?
Well, that is a good question.
Is this the part of it? Is this do the Kurdish movements view these popular movements and uprisings as a way to achieve ethno-nationalist ambitions?
Well, that is a good question, Kayjang. Yes, basically, Kurdish people inside Iranian Kurdistan have some specific demands. Different movements inside Iran have different demands. At this point, these demands have been concentrated on one thing, and that is the toppling the regime. But it doesn't mean that we are giving up on other demands that we have inside Iranian Kurdistan. There are specifically demands for ethnic rights and human rights issues that have been there even before this regime. And if we don't do if we don't reach any structural solution for these issues, they're going to last even if the regime actually changes and topples. So yes, there is always this concern that, as we saw it in Iraqi Kurdistan, as we saw it in the history of Iran, that Kurdish movement gets involved heavily, pays a heavy price at the end of the road. We're facing a situation that nothing has changed, basically, in terms of ethnic rights, in terms of, the rights of Kurdish people to be able to determine their future. So basically, this kind of fear may be overcome by the strength of mobilization that we see in the case of Zhina, but it doesn't mean that it goes away. It doesn't mean that it is not a rational threat there. It is a rational threat because the issues that we have with dominant nationalisms in Iran is not that they don't accept us. Yes, they accept us as little brothers. It's not that they don't say we're not there in Iran. Yes, they say we are there in Iran, but we're little brothers. It's okay if they use Kurdish slogans, but it doesn't mean that using Kurdish slogans doesn't mean basically that they're using, as you mentioned, Kurdish perspective or Kurdish discourse in this case. But quite contrary, still I believe the Iranian nationalism discourse is still strong in Persian society, and that nationalism entails basically looking at ethnicities as some sort of little brothers. And as long as this mentality is not changed, I don't believe that even the change of the regime change is going to make any differences for Kurdish issue. But still, you know, these different movements that are going on in Iran, they, you know, the main signifier that, you know, the signifier that they can all agree upon as the change in regime, because we believe if the regime changes, we're going to face a situation where we can have some sort of, if you may, a new social contract between us, something that, you know, we can get together, discuss our issues, and reach a kind of, you know, agreement among different political parties who represent different groups in Iran. And this social contract builds a new Iran, the Iran of future.
Thank you, Ari. Salah,
could I weigh in here? When Arash speaks about a structural change, I think what he's referring to is a different arrangement between Iran's regions, a federal democratic republic where the powers of the central government are curtailed, where there's extensive decentralization, and where federal entities enter into an agreement with one another in order to advance their unique characteristics. And that agreement addresses three categories: governance, which is decentralized with local control; cultural issues, whereby the cultural rights and freedom of expression are guaranteed; and then local economy, which is control of natural resources, ownership, and hiring preferences. It's fine to go out and chant slogans. It's good therapy, particularly in a country that has ruled through tyranny for so long. But unless there's a structural remedy that Iranians can agree on, there's little prospect of seeing real progress. That's why I was so heartened over 2 years to see the Kurdish political parties come together, debate their ambitions for the future, and then adopt a joint statement affirming federal parliamentary democracy as the best system for guaranteeing their interests.
David, I will have more strategic questions to you very shortly after Salah. Salah, sorry for keeping you waiting for too long. You know, it's the issues are so convoluted that we have to talk a lot. But I'd like to directly ask you this question. Do you expect a regime change? And if not, why? Why popular movements, protest groups, widespread civilian violence in Iran never brings about a regime change in Iran? Is this because the Iranian government and Republican guards, the Revolutionary Guards, are two distinct entities and they require different solutions to be dealt with? Or is this because the Iranian regime has always kept some sort of a control over these masses? Why is it very difficult to change the regime in Iran? And is this possible? Is the change possible to come from within Iran and not with outside intervention?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for Washington Kurdish Institute, another friend who they arranged this meeting. I think we are going through and present the time. Jeng, you asked me a very difficult question. You know,
that's why I invited you.
Thank you. Still, people debating even it is a revolution. You know, what we are witnessing. I know we have all. Just I can point a few things. What is this uprising, if you call it uprising, and is different from previous one. We had a one in 2009, Green Revolution, the Green Movement. Then we had a 3 years ago and previously. But what we have a different now situation. Previously, we didn't have as the thing that I guess discussed. We didn't have this kind of close cooperation among Iranian ethnic groups. We saw very common slogans around Iran. We saw for the first time since 2009 the return of the university students. And university students, when they suppressed in 2009, they were not present, you know, than last 14 years ago. So the students return. We have a city which is always like center of religion for like city of Qom, which is a religious school there. They are burning the security forces vehicles in the Mashhad, even the city of like Khomeini, or a city like Kerman, which is just 3 years ago, it was center of the funeral for Qasem Soleimani. The news said over close to 100 people died. They're burning his huge banner in the city. So we are, and more importantly, we're seeing very, very young people, and again, importantly, the women are the forefront of this struggle. So we are going through very unprecedented, very new phase of the revolution in Iran. If is this revolution gonna bring down this regime, really is difficult to say, but I'm sure, all dictators, if you look at, we have experienced in history, like what happened like in Romania, just hours before the dictator did not accept his defeat. Just look at the Soviet Union. Just look at other, Arab Spring, dictator in Egypt or around the world. They did not accept the reality is changing. Yes, the time before death of the Zhina Amini, before that and now is changed. The clock cannot be turned back to what happening. This is really we seeing, and is developing further. I know a regime trying to do some tactics. They filter the social media. We have no internet in most of part of Iran, but the protest is continued. Is they using different tactics? Maybe we don't have much protest in a smaller city, which was the first week of protest, but the largest city, we have a center of this uprising is continued. They trying to do at night, and now we are going to second phase of this uprising, which is we have more general strike among different groups. The different truck drivers probably go to to the energy sectors and to to the teachers. So, and now we have general strike to the students, university students, and the schools around the country. So we have some similarity with what happened in 1979, as previous weeks and months. So if you remember, in 1979, when bring down one of the powerful military regimes in Middle East, it just happened in 2 days. The final days of the 2 days when the people finally had to hand their gun and they bring down the regime. It was very slow. Just the weeks before the 1979 revolution, it was just we had strikes especially in the energy sector, in the bazaar, which is very famous for Iran's economy market. So we see some similarity. Plus, more important, we see even though the internet is really down in Iran, but see the world is eyes on what's happening in Iran. So I definitely can see this regime is passing through its final phases. I can't say it's going to happen tomorrow or next week or within a month, but definitely we are going through its final phases when eventually, because something happened. In 1979, the Kurds were among the first group. They did not accept this, this regime. The Kurds did not vote for Islamic Republic referendum on April 1979 with majority no. Then the Kurds against they have their armed struggle in 80s for a decade. So eventually Kurds always been in the forefront of this struggle. But
I understand that you support the uprising. Arash said their party had no structural organizational involvement in what's going on in Iranian Kurdistan at the moment. So I ask the same question. If this is so similar to 1979 and prone to bring about big change, as the Komala party, are you involved in what's going on in Iran today, directly or indirectly?
This is not something we can say that's been engineered, something we plan this thing. I know some things. It could be, just look at it. Arab Spring happened. This young man burned himself in Morocco. So when Zhina Amini news come, I think it was because contribute to it. Why, when his body returned to the city, Kurdish city of Sakbaz, to his family, did not accept to bury him at night. So that was really a crucial moment. If it was happened, probably it would be lost that moment. Then it was daytime when the people in the Sakbaz and around Kurdish city, they attended to the funeral, and it was thanks to the social media. It reported around the world, and then the Center for Cooperation of Kurdish Parties did announce the day after the general strike in Kurdistan, and eventually it spread to rest of Iran, and rest of Iran then day by day, that first 4 or 5 days, so they come into common ground. So I think we should look at this, this map, how this thing spread. It doesn't matter, we have some engineer to the Kurdish party, but of course, our Kurdish party not coming from the Mars, we are also part of these people, who's on the ground. So it could be sympathizer, it could be, people who are the Kurdishness and find, the interest in which is national struggle.
Thank you, Salah.
Sorry, Cenk, can I add something here? So to give a better perspective and to give you a background about what is going on and what's going on in Iranian Kurdistan and how Kurdish political parties can play a role or can play a role in the future. Kurdish political parties, as I mentioned, have very good relationship with society, civil society, in different parts of society in Iranian Kurdistan. Whenever they have asked people inside Iranian Kurdistan to go to strike, to do some civil actions there, we receive very good responses from them. This time also, the gravity of the situation, Zhina was killed, and the situation there for a few days, she was in hospital in coma. Now it gathered lots of attention in Iranian Kurdistan. As I mentioned, two strong factors were present there. So the background was ready there. The ground was ready to do some actions there. So basically, Kurdish political parties, the Center for Cooperation, basically asked people to go on and strike after the death of Zhina. And the people did so. And then after that, this cooperation center also said to continue the strike with demonstrations inside streets at 5 p.m.
This was the reason for the cross-border airstrikes on several Kurdish political party positions in Iraqi Kurdistan over the past week?
Yeah, I'm going to go to that also. 5 p.m. basically they asked people to take it to the streets, and they did so. And then because in other parts of Iran also, women were able to somehow connect with this issue. This spilled over to other parts of Iran. Definitely Kurdish political parties play a role in not in terms of orchestrating the whole thing, but in terms of asking people to act, and they get the response. But the Iranian government has this intention to, or has this a tendency to basically blame things on others. And when you're in the street, when you get arrested, they say, okay, you are working for PDKI, and this way you can be you can face even death penalty in Iran, and they can use the words that we are using here or some other places to basically do that, to take those words to the courts and use them as documents to show that yes, there is a relationship between this guy who has been protesting inside the streets of Iran, in, for example, Qom, in Tehran, in Mashhad, with this political party that we consider illegal, that is outside, and they're trying to topple us. So there, a very heinous crime has happened there. So we can actually crack down on them more harshly, and we can actually they can face death penalty, as I mentioned. But in terms of the issue, yes, basically, I believe the Iranian government did so because they wanted to, this was an unprovoked and unjustified attack on our bases, because they wanted to divert the attention, the international attention, from the issues inside Iran. And as Jake Sullivan mentioned, they wanted to find a remedy for the situation inside Iran outside its borders. This has been the policy of Iran. This has been a strategy by Iranian regime to basically do so. Anytime something happens, a crisis happens inside Iran that threatens the regime, they're trying to create a bigger crisis outside their borders so that they can actually control the crisis inside. So the remedy of crisis is creating more crisis in mentality of Iranian.
Thank you, Arsh. Thank you, Tara. We spoke with Salah and Arsh, representing two political parties. And Salah made this point that there are so many similarities between what's happening today in Iran and what happened in 1979 and during the years that led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, with regards to Kurdish involvement, with regards to the involvement of civil society, with regards to the pace of the events, how they unfold overnight and unprecedentedly, and suddenly to bring about a structural change. To what extent do you agree that the large-scale protest movement of today have similarities with 1979 with regards to its capacity to bring about change?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm going to keep it short. Okay, so the Kurds and other minorities in Iran, but in particular the Kurds, they have, as I told you even before, experienced many, many years of oppression and systematic discrimination. And this is not only me saying, this is supported by the UN Special Rapporteur, well-established human rights organizations. As I am a human rights lawyer, I can just give you this information. The Kurds are 10% of Iran's total population, but they represent 50% of the political prisoners in Iran right now. You don't need to be a human rights lawyer to realize that that's very disproportional, that this oppression, it's been ongoing for many, many years, even before the Islamic constitution came into power. So the severe oppression against this minority and the severe violence that the regime, disproportional severe violence that the regime is increasing in the Kurdish area, goes back to the history that we have, the Kurds have. And as also been mentioned, when we're saying that this is a united movement in Iran, that people are together chanting for women, life, freedom, it's too soon to jump into any conclusion to say this will happen or that will happen. But what we can say is that the Iranian regime, they have not changed their strategy. They have just increased violence. Mm-hmm. And or the Kurds have in the history and still are demanding equal political participation as all of the other minorities, because the constitution, the Iranian constitution, is not giving the minorities that. So that needs to be in place in order for the Kurds and other minorities to feel participated and to feel participated within the institutions. But to answer very quickly on your question, yes, the Kurds have a history of the disproportional oppression against them.
Thank you, Tara. David, it's time for my strategic questions to you, unless you want to add something first. But I would like to understand from a geostrategic perspective, what manifestations can these protests bring about in the near future or distant future with regards to Iran and the regional scene and Iran's influence over the region? We've seen that the first retaliation or the mitigation strategy that Iran adopted in the wake of the protests were cross-border attacks on Iraqi Kurdistan, and before then blaming the so-called Western conspiracy, the US, for the unrest in the country. These might be for diverting the attention from inside Iran, diverting the public attention from what's happening on the streets. But it is definitely in a crisis mode. I mean, Iran. So will this crisis mode have any impact on Iran's regional activities, Iran's regional influence, possibly making it more aggressive or trying to maintain the status quo?
So Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, with whom I worked, used to say of Slobodan Milosevic that he tries to solve a problem by creating a bigger one. What's happened here is pretty clear. The regime is trying to distract the Iranian people by blaming others instead of taking responsibility itself for its failure in governance and economy. So by attacking Iraqi Kurds, it's sending a dual message that the Kurds are to blame and Iraqi Kurdistan, which has been a project of the United States, is also to blame. It's a way of avoiding responsibility, of shirking responsibility to take remedial steps. But it's a well-worn tactic among tyrants and dictators to try to broaden the crisis, to distract the people from its own failings. And I think this gets to the important point of how do we anticipate a tipping point? In other situations, it's hard to predict when we reach a tipping point. What are the factors that bring us to that stage? So in Iran, what are the factors that are going to bring us to a change of regime? It could be the armed forces who feel as though they're not being treated fairly. It could be business or economic leaders who feel as though they're disadvantaged. The important thing here is that the revolution in Iran is not going to be led by Iranian Kurds only. It's going to be inclusive and involve all the Iranian people. So for that to happen, the statement that the Iranian Kurdish parties issued on a federal parliamentary democracy needs to be more broadly disseminated. It should be shared with other ethnicities so that they can come on board. There should be a shared vision of what kind of government in the future will allow Iran to move forward and to represent the interests of its diverse polity.
I actually have a follow-up question, David, and you touched upon the question I wrote for you before even I come to that. Very interesting that you mentioned who will bring about the change in Iran, who will be the main actor of change is not known from today, definitely not the Kurdish masses, but might be the armed forces who are dissatisfied with the current regime and everything else. There are some theories about the current status of the Iranian regime is that the regime, the government, and the Revolutionary Guards are two distinct entities, and popular movements opposing the Tehran government may not be seen or might not be seen as a threat to the Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guards. In other words, there are serious allegations and claims that the Revolutionary Guards is a regime within a regime. So a new revolution in Iran cannot be achieved without foreign intervention, because when it reaches the tipping point, as you mentioned, it will witness a brutal intervention from the well-prepared, battle-hardened, and ideologically driven Revolutionary Guards. Do you agree with this? Do you agree that it is almost impossible to achieve these goals without foreign intervention?
So it's important that the movement for change occur organically from within the country. The US can broaden internet access, can play a discrete role, but as we saw previously, we don't want the regime to accuse external forces of trying to engineer its demise. To be sustainable, it has to come up from by Iranians, and it needs to be a broader coalition. And I think that coalition starts with the Iranian Kurdish parties. It involves other ethnic, and religious minorities, the principle of federalism is a galvanizing force. And if Iranians agree that they want more local control over their affairs, then they can develop an inclusive plan that reflects everyone's interests. When we get around to mechanizing that, it's important that we are communicating effectively with the society. That's why whenever there is a regime change, the first thing that's done is to seize the airwaves and to use broadcasting as a way of reaching out to the people as a whole to let them know that there's an alternative to what's going on. I don't think we get to that alternative right away. I think we need to do more work. There needs to be a more internal debate, but it needs to be structural. It can't just be rhetorical. So the structural change that I think appeals most broadly, and I think that this has been confirmed by the Iranian Kurdish parties, is to talk about federalism as a system of government that advances everyone's interests. And because it's inherently based on decentralization, it would marginalize the government in Tehran and hardliners there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a step-by-step process. The Kurds can take the lead, but they need to broaden the coalition to include other groups.
So we have 13 more minutes, and I'd like to advance the conversation from the strategic points that David made to the international politics concerning Iran. Salah, do you think that it is all these occurrences in Iran and the protest movement, human rights violations that Tara mentioned, should be a reason for the West, especially the US, to stop nuclear negotiations with Iran, or should these negotiations continue regardless of what's happening in Iran, like it happened with the Soviet Union in the past, like what happened with North Korea in recent past, that the nuclear deal with Iran is essential for the global security and cannot be sacrificed for human rights issues? Do you agree that that the nuclear negotiations should be a separate topic and should continue as is? We can't hear you, Salah. You're muted.
Yeah, I think we should look at this issue, what you said, from different perspective, you know. In one side, maybe people believe, or majority of Iranians now believe, the regime should be changed. But from perspective of the European and maybe current US administration, they're looking more critical engagement, trying to diffuse what they call the nuclear issue in Iran. Still they believe talking and signing so-called deal, which was really it was failure in 2015. Reviving that deal, it could save the world and region from another nuclear race. So we have this debate, because I saw just a few days ago the same question was asked to Jack Sullivan, asked from Net Price, all they touched upon this question. They said, we are going to do the nuclear deal. Nuclear deal is separate from the human rights issue, and it was big question for reporters or maybe activists and people around the world. You are signing a deal with this regime when it is the most, it's been most isolated regime in the world beside North Korea and Russia. Recently joined the club, and by signing this deal, you allowing to import this oil, to find a market. Is money, it's been freezed, blocked. You return this money, and estimated between 50 to 70 billion dollars. The regime can handle that money. What that money going to spend? Is Iran regime going to build the hospitals or schools or no? That money, which is the same money in 2015 returned to Iran, when in 2015 everybody thought Bashar Assad was not going to stay in power, but he's in power. He's visiting some countries in the region, and we didn't know anything about Houthi that time, but now they are become big factor in the very peace talk in that country. The Hezbollah become big power, So those money, majority of those money went to the proxies of regime in the region.
So can we say engaging in the nuclear deal with Iran will certainly empower or advance Iran's aggression on the popular movement and minorities?
Definitely. No, I'm not against any nuclear deal or Iran be free of nuclear capability, but what mechanism do you have? You sign a deal with Iran with the giving those big chunk of money to the regime. And plus, the regime is at the verge of the worst is human right violation, human right, crackdown at people and cross-border killing. So this is, I don't know what the justification, what the European West as a mechanism can separate this thing. I can't find an answer for that.
You can ask about the justification to Tara. Tara, as a human rights defender, do you feel betrayed that the West continues to engage with Iran on the nuclear deal while all the catastrophe happening inside Iran?
As a human rights lawyer, my job is and has always been to talk about human rights violations in Iran, especially in Iran, because that's something I've been monitoring for several years. And Iran is clearly not responding. We see that statements. The past few days, we have seen statements from the UN and from Western countries, although I think this is good that they are acting. When it comes to international law and international human rights law, I think that a lot of people are disappointed of the outcomes with the legal tools we have. We are restricted. I can make it very short. There is a way, and that's international law. And there we have legal mechanisms, such as the Security Council. And just me saying the Security Council, I think you all know how limited that possibility is. But we have other legal tools. And that is to bring a lawsuit against the Iranian regime through US federal court. Although these legal mechanism or international law mechanism we have are limited or restricted, I think we should still believe in the human rights mechanism that we have, and that there are, if we collect evidence, other ways to make sure that the perpetrators will be held accountable, for example, in US federal court. But it is of course concerning that the Iranian regime is not responding towards the UN Special Rapporteur year after year, saying that you have a severe human rights problem in your country. You are severely violating international law, and they are well aware of that. And we haven't seen any change, just desperate moves and increasing the violence against its people. I think that the West and the international community should continue to pressure Iran. We've seen in the past with several laws inside Iran that pressure do have some effects. Nowadays, we don't, because the violence is increasing. Without saying, I don't think we should stop believing in international community and international attention, putting more pressure on Iran.
Tara, this was very enlightening. Thank you. We are approaching the end of today's discussion within 4 to 5 minutes, but we can't take any questions today because of
Dr. Phillips wants to say something, sorry.
Yes, please, go ahead. Do you want to say it now, Salah, or do you want to wait?
No, Dr. Phillips wants to say his hand up.
Okay, I didn't see it.
So it's always better to negotiate and cooperate than confront. We saw in 2017, when the US withdrew from the JCPOA, that was used by the regime to assume a harder line. So the US should stay at the table. But we should do that and be steely-eyed. Does anyone really think that Iran is going to make an agreement and stick to it? If there is an agreement on nuclear issues, the only way it works is if the government itself is held accountable by the Iranian people. So from a tactical point of view, in the near term, the US should continue its negotiations. But as long as this regime is in place, the likelihood of making a deal and then monitoring and enforcing a deal is very small. So we need to take a long-term view. We don't want the Iranian regime to accuse the West, the US in particular, of scuttling nuclear discussions, but we should be steely-eyed about the process. it's going nowhere unless the Iranian people hold their government accountable.
And this might be the motivation for them to hold the government accountable if the popular movement expands and continues.
So we clearly have a division in the world now between autocracies and democracies. The events in Ukraine make that clear. Now, we should recognize with absolute certainty that Iran is an autocratic regime, it's unreliable, and it's not a good international partner. That doesn't mean that we break off talks. We just have to know going in with eyes wide open with whom we're dealing, and then find the right combination of carrots and sticks, which include the Iranian people as enforcers of any deal.
Thank you, David. I'd like to wrap up this conversation with one of the questions I saw in the chat group, which I found interesting, and I find it a way to also summarize what we have been talking about, as this panel was designed to speak about the Kurdish issue per se, but we ended up speaking about everything that concerns Iran. I'd like to direct the final question to Arish in a very precise way. Arish, are the Kurdish movements, parties, groups, not only your party, but the entirety, are you ready for a disaster scenario? Are you ready, or are you making any preparations to defend the Kurds against potentially expanded regime brutality? Are you preparing to confront the Iranian regime in Iraq and in Iran in case if attacks are conducted against you and other political parties? I want a quick answer, please.
To be very quick, I can say yes. We are prepared. We have always been prepared. The revolution started in 1979 with a disaster. In the first 2 decades, the fight was going on, and it was really heavy. And, right now, in the past few years, we have always been studying the situation, and we have been studying hypothetical situations and how can we be ready for that. We are increasing our capacities on the borders, on the mountains, and inside Iranian society. We're increasing our military capacities. We're increasing our, organizational capacities inside Iranian society. Look, we know that the reactions that the Iranian regime shows, the reactions of Iranian regime, they basically show that they are afraid of us as much as people in Iran are afraid of the regime. Especially, the regime is afraid of Kurdish political parties, and they target the Kurdish political parties more frequently because they believe this, as the Kurdish political parties have shown that they are the most viable threat to the regime. We have been able to challenge the regime in Kurdistan, and now with this uprisings, the effects of our decision, the effects of our resistance has been challenging them in the whole Iran. So I believe we have been studying this, and we are ready if something happens to go in full scale.
Thank you very much. Arish, Salah, Tara, David, thank you for all these insightful commentary. Is there a question somewhere? David, do you want to say something? I saw your hand was raised.
Just a quick comment that what they're really afraid of is freedom and representative government. The fact that the Kurds have come together and they've agreed on a roadmap for advancing their freedom goals and their democratic self-government must simply terrify the regime. If that discussion is broadened to include other ethnicities and then all Iranians, then you're laying the groundwork for sustainable political transition.
Thank you, David. So once again, David, Arish, Tara, Salah, thank you for all these insightful comments and the discussion today. We started with summarizing the situation in Iran, from human rights perspectives, from the perspectives of the political situation in the country, but we ended up talking about its regional ramifications and beyond, especially with points focusing on what should be done by the Kurdish movement in the future. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for all the attendees watching this, and everyone who will watch this recording of this conversation in the future on YouTube. Thank you very much again. Have a great one.